The rallying cry of the Republic's clone troopers was that they were an army of one man, but the right man for the job, and indeed, the Grand Army of the Republic did its job well, all things considered. It did, after all, defeat the Confederacy's droid army against staggering odds, ending the Clone Wars with a decisive victory for the Republic turned Empire. But could the Republic have done better? Were there downsides to the clone army? As it would turn out, there were, and in this video, we're going to take a look at them.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Now, it should be said that the Grand Army of the Republic was a vast improvement over what the Republic had been forced to work with previously, and the clone troopers produced by the Kaminoans were indeed some of the greatest soldiers in the history of the galaxy, but they weren't perfect. The Mandalorians, for example, were far more skilled and effective, and there were also issues inherent to clones that complicated matters for the Republic. These flaws weren't really discussed as much, as none of them were crippling, but they were still very present. The Grand Army of the Republic had three major flaws. The first came directly from the primary influence on clone development, the Kaminoans, the cloners responsible for the army's creation. As we've discussed before, the Kaminoans were borderline sociopathic when it came to how they treated their clones. They expected total uniformity, both genetically and behaviorally. Aberration from any of these norms typically resulted in euthanasia. There were a number of well-known flaws in the cloning process itself as well, though the Kaminoan method successfully eliminated many of them. Clones produced by more traditional methods were typically far less effective, as they were grown much faster and flash trained for whatever duties they were made to perform. Flash training essentially imprinted the memories of a template onto clones, allowing them to instantly learn how to perform a task. It was standard procedure for pretty much all non-Kaminoan cloners, but it had several glaring flaws. First off, it was a poor excuse for proper training, and it showed in the performance of flash-trained clones. Secondly, it tended to lead to clone madness. In general, clone madness was a huge risk of cloning. It was a sort of extreme identity crisis that would drive the clones to insanity, resulting in violent instability. That risk was largely why we don't hear much about clones outside of the Clone Wars era. Fear of clone madness kept the cloning market on the fringe. Now, the Kaminoans managed to eliminate the risk of clone madness and the shortcomings of flash training by growing their clones at a relatively slow pace and training them properly. So these problems don't apply to most of the Grand Army. But the Kaminoans weren't actually the only cloners involved in supplying the Republic with soldiers. Near the end of the war, a second clone army was grown in secret using conventional methods on Centax II, one of Coruscant's moons, which was dispatched to reinforce the Kaminoan clones after the Battle of Coruscant. The Centax II clone troopers were outwardly indistinguishable from their Kaminoan counterparts, but they were markedly less effective due to the aforementioned flaws. It was the Kaminoans who crafted most of the inherent strategies of the GAR. Through genetic tampering, they not only made the clones stronger, more effective, and more obedient, but they also eliminated a bunch of secondary concerns that most people wouldn't even think of. The clones didn't have allergies, for example, and they all liked the same food, which made supplying the Grand Army a hell of a lot easier than it would be for a recruited army of a comparable size. In this manner, the Kaminoans sought to create the perfect soldiers, with the added bonus of them being easier to supply and quarter than a recruited army would be, especially an army large enough to defend the Republic. The Kaminoans also indoctrinated the clones to be as behaviorally identical as possible. For the most part, they all thought the same way, fought the same way, and believed the same things, or at least, that was how the Kaminoans wanted it to be. In a sense, the Kaminoans designed the perfect soldier based on the template of Jango Fett, and then split him into millions of identical individuals. This was intended to make it easier for them to fight seamlessly in larger units, almost like an insect hive. Ethical concerns aside, this was a sound strategy, and it was particularly effective when it came to countering the armies fielded by the Confederacy, which largely fought as a collective. But there were some severe drawbacks to having an army of one man. The most obvious is the colossal danger that is shared genetics. Since every clone in the GAR had the same genetic code, all separatist scientists needed was a sample of clone DNA to be able to cripple the whole army. Bioweapons that specifically targeted shared genetic code could be absolutely devastating, and unfortunately for some clones, this wasn't a hypothetical problem. The Separatists attempted to exploit the clones' genetic uniformity multiple times, and while none of their attempts succeeded in crippling the GAR, several of them were close calls. The Confederacy did love its bioweapons after all, and it certainly would not have hesitated to use them to slaughter millions of clones at once. There was also a danger to the psychological side of uniformity too. It was very easy for Separatist commanders to analyze how clones thought and fought, and once they determined patterns they could exploit, they could effectively fight the clones on a galactic scale. In theory, though not in practice, it also opened the door to psychologically breaking clones en masse. If a Separatist interrogator could find a way to crack one clone, they could crack them all, and the Confederacy could demoralize the Grand Army on a tremendous scale. The second major flaw of the Grand Army of the Republic was how expensive it was. The Republic's fight for survival was hampered by the tremendous strain the war effort put on the economy, and while that might sound like a bit of a lesser concern, it hurt a lot of civilians pretty badly. The Clone Wars would have put a massive strain on the Republic economy no matter what, but the nature of the Clone Army did make it worse. It's incredibly expensive to spend 10 years growing, training, and eventually equipping a single clone, and an army of millions of them is something only the Republic could afford. An army of recruited soldiers, even one of skilled, well-equipped and well-paid soldiers, would have been a whole lot cheaper. That was the biggest advantage the CIS had after all. Its battle droids were much cheaper than either, and as a result, the Confederacy was able to muster the largest army in galactic history. The third big flaw was one that, in all honesty, the Republic probably didn't even consider: integration. The clone troopers of the Grand Army were incongruous with the rest of the galactic society, and there were manifold problems with integrating them into society once the war was over. No matter how the Republic handled the Grand Army after the war, there would have been problems, whether they kept the clones as a standing army or tried to integrate them into civilian life. It would have been a disaster for the Republic if they tried to integrate clones into civilian society. There'd be an uproar immediately from the disadvantaged, who would surely blame the clones for flooding the job market, which would inevitably result in discrimination and all the problems that come with it. Even without that, clones would have an incredibly hard time adapting to civilian life, which they never knew and had no training for. Civilian life would be wholly alien to clones, and the clones would be just as alien to most civilians. On top of that, there are also serious genetic risks to flooding the galactic gene pool with millions of identical genes and unbalancing the gender ratio in the process. But if the Republic kept the clones on as a standing army, they'd have even more problems to deal with. The rapid aging of the clones meant that the army would have died off quickly, so the Republic would have had to keep buying more and more clones or slowly let the GAR die out. Either would be a tremendous waste of money that the government most definitely could not have afforded, especially not when it was recovering from such a massive conflict as the Clone Wars. In reality, the rise of the Empire and the resultant changes to galactic society prevented the Clone Army from being all that much of a problem after the Clone Wars. The Empire was much more capable of supporting a standing army than the Republic would have been in the post-war era, and furthermore, it didn't need to care about people angry about the job market when it had secret police to murder dissenters with. But conditions were different for the Republic, and so the Empire's approach to handling the GAR post-war would not have worked out for it. This was pretty widely known during the Clone Wars, and separatist propagandists used it as a fear-mongering tactic to garner support for the Confederacy. There were also some pretty serious flaws with how clones were outfitted. Phase 1 clone armor was derisively called a body bucket because of how uncomfortable it was and how it tended to slow clones down in combat. This was a large part of why Phase 2 armor became a thing. However, there were other flaws with clone armor that Phase 2 didn't correct. For example, clones always had a rather crappy hand protection. They got a plate for the back of the hand, an extension of the body glove, and nothing else to protect their hands. This was a severe oversight, considering that hand-to-hand combat can be a necessity in the heat of battle, and you don't want to fight a walking lump of metal with unprotected fists. So those are some of the major flaws with the Republic's clone troopers, but what do you think? Can you think of any others that we may have missed? And does this video give you a bit of a different perspective on the clones? Let us know in the comments section below. And just before you go guys, please do check out the links in the description below if you want to join our wider Geeksleys community. You can check us out on our Discord where you can talk to myself and other Star Wars fans, our Geeksleys Gaming Network where you can play games with other Star Wars fans, and the Patreon if you want to help support the channel. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.